So, welcome back to, oops, I'll mute you there for a second. Welcome back to ID24. ID24 is brought to you by the Paciello Group with a kind support from Barclays and the Center for Inclusive Design. You can find out more about these organizations on our website. If you like this session, which is our, which one is it? The 15th session of today. Hit that like button and subscribe to the ID24 channel for all future event streams and videos. And a quick hello and thank you to organizations who have decided to host their own local ID24 event. And currently we have Sapient Razorfish in Germany. They've been streaming most of the presentations this morning from 4 locations in their offices in Germany. And also joining us now should be Q Delft in the Netherlands. So hello and thank you to those organizations. Don't forget to the listeners at home, don't forget to send questions for presenters by tweeting them with the hashtag ID24. And at the end of the presentation, we'll pass on these questions to the presenters. And for each session, we will also do a draw for the best question, and the best question will receive a free 90-day JAWS license. One additional note on YouTube, we have enabled the chat, but we are not monitoring it for questions to the presenters. It's purely there for participants to talk amongst themselves. So without further ado, our next presentation will be from Rocio, Calvo and Raphael Clegg-Vinell, both from AbilityNet, and they're going to talk about accessibility at all stages. And over to you now.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to everybody for joining today to this webinar. And also thank you for Paciello Group for the invitation. And today we are going to talk about accessibility at all stages and how to make your products more inclusive. But first, who we are. So I am Rocio Calvo. I am a senior accessibility consultant here for AbilityNet.
And I'm Raphael Clegg-Vinell, and I'm also a senior accessibility and usability consultant for AbilityNet.
And well, AbilityNet helps people with disabilities at work, but it's a charity that helps people with disabilities at work, at education, and at home, to try to make more digital products more accessible for everybody. And before we start with this webinar, I would like to say what accessibility means. So if we focus on the words of the person who invented the internet, accessibility is making the web and the web services available to all individuals, whatever the hardware or software, network infrastructure, language, culture, geographic location, or physical or mental aptitude. From this quote, it's clear to see that accessibility and inclusive design is not just about helping people with disabilities. It's about helping everyone. When we are doing inclusive designs, we are, of course, benefiting people with disabilities. But what I really want to emphasize today is that it is not a nice thing to have. It's something necessary. Because, for example, when we are creating accessible websites and apps, this will allow people to independently do their banking, shopping, or socialize without having to have someone to help them. Also, if we are creating accessible transportation, this is going to allow people to get from one place to another, which will otherwise be not possible. And finally, if we are creating, for example, accessible architecture, this will allow people to get into buildings and successfully move around them. So it's something that I would like to emphasize, that when we are creating something accessible and we are making something inclusive, it is going to help people with disabilities to be more independent. Also, when we are creating inclusive design products, we are benefiting businesses and organizations. So the public perception will be increased. So our customers will consider that we are doing something good for the society, and also we are increasing the compatibility of our services with different programs and with different systems. And also it is going to improve the search engine optimization. Because if we are creating, for example, a website which is accessible, Google will rank it in a better position, and we will attract more customers. Also, your return of investment will be increased, mainly because keep in mind that people with disabilities are more loyal. So if they know that something works, they stick to it. They don't try to use other different software or other different solutions, maybe because they know that sometimes they can cause more problems for them. And also, it is going to help you avoid lawsuits, which is going to cost you a lot of time, money, etc.
So many of the products and services which make our lives easier were designed with disabilities in mind first. So for example, the electric toothbrush was first designed for people with limited motor impairments. And it benefits people without motor impairments too, though, of course, and so is more efficient for a much wider range of people. It's also more effective as a toothbrush. And there are lots of other examples of things which were designed first with disabilities in mind, but which also help people without disabilities. And these can include things like ramps, which you see at lots of art exhibitions, museums, and so on. Potato peelers, and closed captioning as well, videos. Too often, people only think of disabilities as clinically diagnosed disabilities. However, here are some really great examples from Microsoft, which show how we can also have temporary and situational disabilities. So in this first example, there's someone who's got one arm, and that's of course a permanent disability. But as a temporary disability, someone might have broken their arm, or as I do at the moment, have tendinitis, which I'm hoping doesn't become a permanent disability. But you could also have a situational disability. So for example, a mother could be holding their child with their dominant right hand. And so if they were using a mobile phone, they would have a situational disability when using that device. And there are lots of other examples of this. One more. Someone who's blind as a permanent disability, someone with a temporary disability with an eye impairment might have cataracts, for example. And then you might have a distracted driver who's angrily shouting at their children in the back seat. That would be a situational disability. Now, in order to carry out inclusive design, you need to consider temporary and situational disabilities as much as possible, as well as permanent disabilities. And empathy and awareness for other people's different access needs are key, but you need to think about how you can make your product or service as inclusive to as many people as possible. I'm sure you're all aware of how a typical software development cycle works. There are a lot of different design methodologies, and companies follow different approaches depending on their size, their deliverables, budgets, resources, and so on. In a typical software development cycle, there's likely to be the following 4 stages in some form or other. So you've got analysis here, design, implementation, and testing. And we're going to refer to it as a software development cycle, but this process can apply to apps, websites, and even hardware. Many companies don't consider accessibility at all, but fortunately this is changing and we're all playing our part. We work in an industry which is still maturing though, and even some of the bigger companies I've worked with only consider accessibility very late on in the development cycle, often the testing phase. When accessibility is only considered by companies at this sort of testing phase, it usually takes the form of a WCAG or 508 audit. There are other variables too, but they're quite common. And although auditing or testing at this stage can still make some improvements to the accessibility of a website or app, it's almost always too little too late. it often feels like companies are just trying to tick a load of boxes so they don't get sued, if their only commitment to accessibility is to audit their products at the last minute. And meeting accessibility guidelines does not ensure a website or app has a good user experience. It might just mean more people can technically access the site that meets guidelines, and that you're just giving a higher number of people the misfortune of using it. And if people have terrible experiences on your site or app, they'll probably take their business elsewhere. So only considering accessibility late on can have a lot of unwanted consequences. And I'm sure lots of you have had a head-in-hand moments or two when you've been asked to look at the accessibility of a product at the last moment, only to find it has a terrible sort of user experience and is a complete disaster for people with different access needs. So one of many examples I have is when I was asked to carry out an accessibility audit of a mortgage application for a major bank. Change the styling here, as I have no intention of naming and shaming. They had a sort of highly complex drag and drop interface, and it was completely inaccessible for screen reader and keyboard users on desktop and mobile. And this company had actually already carried out multiple rounds of usability testing, but they hadn't included any visually impaired or keyboard-only users. They had a week to launch the app, and it had so many major issues, they were unable to fix them in time. And at the risk of potential legal action if they launched the app with these issues, they decided to delay the launch date and scrap the drag and drop interface altogether. And as a result, the client had to redesign again, and as you can imagine, this had a significant waste of time and money involved.
Another example happened to one of our customers. We identified one issue also at the end of the process when we did an audit. And this issue was that when a client wanted to cancel an application, let's say that they wanted to apply for a new bank account and they wanted to cancel it, there was not any confirmation that this has been canceled, that this about the status of the process. They didn't know anything about this. So the client understood the problem. The client was saying that it is true, this is an issue, not only for people with disabilities, for everybody. And they knew that. But there was a bigger problem. The problem was that they were using it in different journeys. So it was not only when you wanted to open a bank account, it was when you wanted to apply also to a credit card. And another problem was that they were using it across different brands. So you can figure out now which were the implications for this particular issue. It was going to be a headache for them because they needed to redesign the process, they needed to redesign the journeys, they needed to make the changes in the code, and it was going to cost them a lot of time, effort, and money. But they knew that they had to change it. If we had identified that in the design process, they will have changed it in the design, and they will have not implement any page with this kind of issues. And another problem that we have identified is that nowadays, clients are trying to use custom controls, which are very cool, are very nice to have in your websites. But sometimes what we don't know is that these custom controls can cause problems for people with disabilities, mainly because when you are customizing a new control, you need to consider that you need to create it in an accessible way as well. So there are some developers that forget that these custom controls need to be accessible also when a person is interacting using the keyboard, or when they are using voice interaction, etc. And in this particular custom control that we identified was a slider, which was very nice. I want to emphasize that, but it could not be controlled using the keyboard. So if we had identified that in the design process, we will have pointed that an alternative solution could be provided. So they could have the slider, which is very nice, but also they could have an input text field, which will be very useful for people that are using the keyboard, and they will be able to use the input text field instead of the slider. So, as we want to emphasize here in this talk, accessibility needs to be considered as soon as you have got the marvelous idea of a new project. It doesn't matter if you are going to create a new website for a bank, or it doesn't matter if you are going to create a new telephone. You need to consider accessibility at the very beginning, in the analysis phase of the software development project process. It is very, very, very important to consider it at the beginning, because then it is going to save a lot of money, a lot of resources, and a lot of time for your organization. So please start considering accessibility at the very beginning. But also, not only the organization is going to get a benefit of considering accessibility at the beginning. We need to consider now that employees are also affected when accessibility is considered at the end of the process. You might say, why they are affected? Well, mainly because if they are considered at the end of the process, they are going to receive a list of bugs that they need to fix. And they are going to be stressed because they need to fix all these issues, let's say 50 issues, before the project is launched. And this is going to cause them a lot of headaches, stress, etc. And as a result, they are going to see accessibility as an annoying thing that they need to do at the end of the process. And also it is going to cause them a lot of stress. But to be honest, I understand their feelings. I understand why they are feeling this way. Mainly because imagine that I have to launch a project next week and I receive all these issues today. So I have 1 week to fix all these issues on top of everything that I have to do. How do you think that I will feel? I will feel stressed. I will feel like I don't want to fix this. I don't want to do all this stuff. Why do I have to do it? So when we are considering accessibility at the beginning of the process, it is going to help also your employees and to make them on board with accessibility.
We previously talked about the 4 stages that we mentioned for the software development lifecycle. And I'm just going to go through some of the things that can be considered at each stage. We'll go into some of these in a bit more detail. So at the analysis stage, you've got requirement specifications, and you should sort of include accessibility as part of the requirements. Here you can think about how accessibility is included in things like focus groups, training sessions, and so on. And the design phase, interface designs should consider different interaction techniques and the accessibility of things like color and typography. Design reviews can be carried out here, and Raphael is going to explain these in a bit more detail shortly. At the implementation phase, accessibility best practices, accessibility requirements should be followed when the implementation is being conducted. And accessibility training can be carried out for any teams who need it. So developers, for example, know how to code accessible applications. And the testing phase, this should cover things like different assistive technology testing, cross-browser device testing, and so on. And although WCAG audits can now be included as part of this, things like user testing also need to be carried out too, so that you're actually testing your product with real users. And this includes people with different access needs. To sum up the sort of software development cycle, before we go into it in a bit more detail, accessibility should be considered as early as possible, of course. And any good business, you have to get the foundations right, and accessibility needs to be fully ingrained as part of this. You don't start thinking about how an engine fits in a car once you've got the body, and you don't start building a house without getting the foundations right first. We're all responsible for ensuring that the products we work on can not only be accessed by as many people as possible, but also have a good user experience. Whether you're a developer, tester, UI designer, or project manager, you have your part to play in this. And Rocio is now going to explain some of the things which can be done by different roles in an organization to ensure that accessibility is included throughout the development process.
If it depends on your role, you will have to consider different things. But if you are, for example, a business analyst, the first thing that you need to think about is that you need to consider all your customers. There are going to be different necessities. There are going to be different interactions. There are going to be different ways of seeing your product. So it is important that you are considering accessibility and also different disabilities when we are starting to think about the new product. Also, it is important to identify related laws, standards, and guidelines related to this specific product. Because if you are not considering them, if you are not considering the accessibility necessities related to this specific product, you are ignoring them, and maybe at the end of the process, or once you have coded the whole software, you will identify that you have missed something. So it is important to consider it at the beginning. I just want to mention that, for example, if you are designing a new website for an airline, in US, there is a specific law that says that is related to airline websites. So it's important to consider that at the very beginning. Also, it is really, really important to engage stakeholders. Everybody will consider that accessibility is very important. And what can you do to engage them? Well, probably if you are doing a user testing session, you can invite different stakeholders to see the different problems that people are facing when they are using your products. So it will be very useful for them to see the problems that people are, how they struggle, basically. And also maybe you can create some company days to specify how different people interact with the systems, etc. So you will generate a lot of empathy about these new interactions. Also, if you are a project manager, of course, you need to try to minimize accessibility defects. I know that this is one of the main purposes. So as you want to minimize accessibility defects, you have to try to consider, or you have to consider accessibility in every step of the process. This will help you to minimize the number of defects that are going to be identified at the end in the testing phase. And also it is important to assign responsibilities. So within a specific department, within a specific group, you can specify maybe who is the responsible of accessibility. You can specify that you can create a new role, which is the accessibility champion. So then everybody will go to this person and will speak with this person in particular when they will need something about accessibility. Also, designers need to create accessible designs, of course. So they need to consider that there are different ways of interaction. They need to know that not everybody is going to use a mouse and a keyboard. There are some people that can use only keyboard, and there are some people that can use only voice interaction software. So this is something that they need to keep in mind when they are designing new products. What can they use? They can use disability simulation tools that are going to be very useful to understand the different disabilities. And for example, they can use visual impairment simulation tools that are going to tell them the different problems that people that have, for example, color blindness, or the different problems that people with glaucoma can have. And finally, you have to make your designs as simple as possible. If you have to explain how a design works, if you have to explain how your system works, then it means that your system is not simple And this means that a lot of people are not going to be able to use it. People with cognitive disabilities, maybe, or people with learning disabilities, or who knows, maybe elderly people will not be able to use it. So keep it simple. Nowadays, a lot of people and a lot of organizations are considering that developers are the only people that are responsible of accessibility. As you can see from this talk, this is not true. A lot of roles need to be involved in accessibility, but also developers need to keep in mind that they need to code accessible code. So, for example, they can follow standards, they can follow HTML standards, and they can, in order to try to avoid inconsistencies or problems that are going to cause across different platforms. Also, they can use pattern libraries. So if you have coded something that is accessible, something that you really know that is accessible, try to use it all the time and try to embed it into different pages. So you don't have to code it from scratch all the time that you want to create, for example, a button or you want to create a carousel. And this is going to be very helpful for making changes. Also, if you want to make a code accessible, it will be very useful if you make it reusable. So when you are embedding the same controls across different pages, if you have to change something in particular because you have detected that there is a bug, or if you want to update the colors or whatever, you will need to change it only in one page. So you don't have to change it in 1,000 pages, which is going to cost a lot of time and money. And now Raph is going to speak about the analysis phase.
We focus on the software development lifecycle again. The analysis phase is where we should start considering accessibility, and this is where the project starts. In this phase, there's lots of different methods which can be used to include accessibility. For example, you can use interviews, focus groups, personas, and so on. I've listed some others, and this is by no means exhaustive. But if we're doing these, different methodologies, you can really help clearly define the accessibility requirements that you need to include in your project. If I pick on focus groups, for example, they're a traditional market research technique for gathering feedback and insights from customers. And if you ensure that customers with disabilities and impairments are included, it means you're likely to learn some really great insights into how your product can be made more inclusive from people with different access requirements. And there's lots of different things you can get out of focus groups, from feedback, thoughts, their preferences, necessities from different customers and so on. But you're also likely to discover things like, new interaction techniques or ways of using your product that you might not have thought of previously. And some of the big benefits for this is that by learning early on about different navigation techniques or requirements that different customers might have when using your product or service, you can really help avoid massive future changes, which can be very costly and time consuming.
Also in the design phase is when you have to still consider accessibility. It's when your product or your project is started to get shaped. It's when you are going to start seeing what you want to create. So it is very important also to consider accessibility in this phase. There are different methods that you can use. For example, you can use card sorting, you can use design reviews, storyboards, wireframes, and you can decide which is the best one for your team, or you can decide what is the best one for the specific product or project. Let's focus on the design reviews. Design reviews are going to be done by experts mainly, and you will be able to point some existing accessibility issues that are presented in these designs, and also it will be able to identify potential issues that could cause problems in the future. So do you remember the issue that we were talking before about the sliders? Well, mainly, if we have had this design with the slider, we will have pointed that the sliders sometimes cause accessibility problems for some users. So then we will have pointed to provide an alternative. So an alternative input text field that users can use as well. And ideally, these reviews can be done in in low fidelity prototypes or in high fidelity prototypes. It depends on the stage of your product. What do we want to get from these design reviews? Well, we want to understand which are the requirements that are misunderstood. So if we have specified requirements in the analysis phase that are misunderstood, we will be able to identify this here. We will be able to identify complicated interactions. So what I was talking about before about keep it simple. Yeah, so we will be able to identify these problems here. And also we will be able to identify if the designs don't follow standards. So for example, it's a standard that usually menus are on the top of the page. So if suddenly the menu is at the bottom of the page, this is going to cause problems for some users because they will not be able to find this menu. And also, these design reviews are going to have benefits. So they are not very expensive. They can be done very quick, and issues will be able to will be identified quickly. And also, it is important to specify that as we are in the design phase, and the code has not started yet, it will be these issues will be identified in the early stages of the software development life cycle, and it will be very useful for your team because you will not spend a lot of time and money with it. Now, Raph is going to speak about the implementation phase.
With the implementation stage, this is usually where websites and apps get coded and designs hopefully start coming to life. There's lots of different things that could be done at this stage, but to pick out a few here, I've listed usability testing, heuristic evaluations, and expert reviews. And if I concentrate for now on usability testing, most companies carry out some form of usability testing. Most people have cottoned on to how important it is to have a sort of user-centered design approach, and a lot of companies at least do this. But there's still a lot of companies out there who don't include people with different access needs as part of the usability testing. And this is obviously silly for lots of reasons. But for all the reasons that we pointed out earlier, it doesn't make very inclusive products, and it's also very costly and waste of time if you have to make big decisions later in terms of changing designs because you haven't considered people who, for example, use a screen reader user who have upper limb or even lower limb, depending on the product or service, motor impairments, and people with cognitive disabilities. So what I advise as much as possible is that as a standard part of usability testing, try to include a good range of people who do have different access needs. And this will not only be useful to help make changes early on to your product or service, but it's also really great for a learning perspective as well. So I've carried out hundreds, if not thousands of hours of testing with screen readers, for example, but I myself am not reliant on a screen reader. So I'm never going to be able to use a screen reader in quite the same way as someone who is reliant on one. And so I'm likely to learn new insights into how screen reader users actually use a website through moderating or observing user testing sessions. And in terms of what you get out of it, of course, good feedback about the product or service that you're testing, and any issues or barriers that that customer or customers, users might experience with the product or service that you're testing out. And yeah, you get really useful different perspectives, feedback, of course, and also often a small sample of the types of issues that you find are likely to be the same for other people who have the same access requirements. So, for example, if you find that there's a button on a website that's inaccessible to a keyboard and screen reader user, that issue, of course, is likely to be exactly the same for any other screen reader or keyboard only user.
Now we are going to focus on the testing phase. Currently, in the testing phase is where we are including accessibility, and this is what we are trying to avoid. But still, even if we have followed the process that we are mentioning here, we still need to do some testing in the final testing phase. We are humans, we can make mistakes, and we can have missed something. So still, we need to test if everything has been done as we expected. Which kind of methods can be done in the testing phase? So you can do audits to try to identify the accessibility problems, and also you can do usability testing, as you can have done in different phases before. If we focus on audits at this stage should identify very few issues, okay? Because you have already gone through a process which allows you to identify most conformance accessibility issues much earlier on. But still, as I said, you can identify some issues. However, you should not get 50 issues we talk about people getting earlier in our talk. Instead, you might only find a handful of issues at this moment. What?
So yeah, on the auditing stage, there's lots of different things you can get out of it, but often it's making sure that accessibility meets at least a minimum level of accessibility according to particular guidelines. Now, we don't have time today to go through, the pros and cons of accessibility against guidelines. If guidelines didn't exist, a lot of companies would do nothing at all, unfortunately. But they do at least give companies a lot of sort of reading material in terms of help and support and documentation to make sure that their websites and apps can at least meet a sort of minimum level of accessibility. Not necessarily a good user experience, but at least enable people to be able to use websites and apps. As Raphael said, though, hopefully at this stage, you're only getting a handful of issues because we've gone through all the other previous processes we've talked about, which means that you've ironed out all of these issues before you get to this stage. And this should make audits a lot cheaper, quicker too, perhaps less expert involvement, because if you're confident that you've actually gone through a load of previous processes to identify accessibility issues, then you don't perhaps need the expert level of knowledge late on at this stage in the process. And it puts a lot less pressure on teams as well. As Rocio mentioned earlier, no developer wants to get an audit on their desk a week before they're launching some multi-million-pound app that's got sort of 50 or 60 issues that they've got to iron out in no time at all. So yeah, this really alleviates pressure on individuals, teams, and businesses. To sum everything up from our talk today, accessibility should be considered as early as possible. In any good business, you have to get the foundations right first, and accessibility needs to be fully ingrained in this. So include accessibility as early as possible. Consider how you can include accessibility at each stage of the development process. And also, perhaps most importantly, involve users with a wide range of different access needs throughout your processes so that you have a user-centered design approach, which is inclusive. Accessibility is something that you own. We're all responsible.
So it is important that you make sure that everybody is on the same page. You need to avoid losing money and, of course, precious time. And getting it right, you will probably attract more customers. Thank you very much. Now I don't know if you have any questions.
Yeah, sorry. It took me a second to find the button. I'm just going to mute you because there's a bit of an echo. No, that was an outstanding presentation. Again, it kind of mirrors what we've heard in some of the presentations previously today already about the importance of integrating, you know, accessibility thinking, testing, etc., at all stages. And probably from where I'm standing, you know, we see a lot of work coming in that is at the accessibility audit stage. And as we know at that point, if nothing has been done yet, it may be a lot of work to kind of go back and retrofit things. So absolutely, the lesson here of, you know, integrating accessibility and accessibility thinking at all the stages is certainly an important one. So
let me.
Oh.
I wanted to jump in here. I just wanted to point out that the slide that showed the picture of the toy car with the motor that was clearly bigger than the chassis could handle. I thought that was a nice visualization, because we see lots of variations on that theme, or at least I do because I'm in the space. But I like the idea of the car that clearly could not be assembled because the yeah, that one on the right. The house is a great image too, but the car that cannot be assembled, because part of me thinks that we're going to see a picture of a car in a moment where there's just a hole cut in the roof with a big piece of metal sticking out of it, which would be, you know, just the natural progression.
No, so that was perfect. Thank you very much. Now, there is a question that just flew in. Sorry, I'm just going to mute you again for a second. Question that just flew in on Twitter. In the analysis phase, when doing research with people with various disabilities, do you use specific guidance in order to make sure that the research is done with sensitivity and awareness? If so, can you share this, or what things do you do?
Yeah, the place we work, we've got quite a big database of people with all sorts of different disabilities. And in terms of who we use, we try to use as many people with different varying disabilities as possible. That's something that we try to discuss with clients up front. And that also means looking at the product or service we're testing, of course, to see, you know, what sort of challenges might be faced or who they're expecting might actually use that product or service. In terms of sort of being sensitive, I think that's something that we always do, sort of disability awareness training and so on. And it also helps that we've got colleagues with disabilities as well. So we learn a lot about when it comes to sort of moderating sessions or doing research for people with disabilities. You know, how they like to be treated, but often, you know, we're all people, and I think in terms of sensitivity, you know, it's just talking to people like human beings. In terms of who we include, though, as many people as possible, really. It's good to, of course, get you know, a whole range of different disabilities, so you get different perspectives on things. And you know, while having a particularly cluttered interface, for example, with lots of busyness going on, might be a particular barrier for someone with autism, for example. It's likely to be something that's going to cause issues for a much wider demographic too.
And also there are some, let's say, guidelines that you need to keep in mind when you are talking with people with disabilities. So for example, if you are talking with a person that have hearing impairments, don't cover your mouth. And also if you are trying to show something in a piece of paper and you are talking with a person with visual impairments, so in this case, you cannot say something like, oh, you see here, without explaining what is in the paper. So there are some things that you need to keep in mind when you are doing this research as well.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much for those answers. Right. So once again, thank you very much for taking part and presenting here at ID24. A reminder that ID24 is brought to you by the Paciello Group with kind support from Barclays and the Center for Inclusive Design. And you can find out more about those organizations on our website. If you like this session, hit that like button and subscribe to the ID24 channel for any future event streams and videos. And the winner of the Twitter competition for the best question for this round, that gets the 90-day JAWS license, is Noel Campbell-Smith at Quicksilver TO. And we'll be in touch with you in a second just to get your details for the license. So we're going to take a short break and we're going to be back on the hour with our next session. But in the meantime, thank you very much.